Hi everybody, I'm painting for you today. There's a lot, so I'm just going to jump into this. I suppose the topics that I want to cover are ways of simplifying a very complex scene or what can look like daunting amounts of information. This happens all the time, but I think it's one way it's most clearly illustrated is when we use reference photos from which to paint. Now, I don't say that you shouldn't use reference photos. I just say they come with some built-in issues. The subject I'm painting today is this. This is in New York City, here where I live. The Queensborough Bridge, or more, I suppose, colloquially or typically known as the 59th Street Bridge. It's very beautiful. It spans from the Manhattan side here to Roosevelt Island over to Queens. Built in, I think, the early 1900s, 1910, 1909, I believe. So it's old. It's gorgeous. It's a steel cantilever suspension bridge. Anyway, it's just beautiful sculpturally. And I've always wanted to try to do a painting of it at least once. The other day, we took, there's a tram, an elevated tram from Manhattan to Roosevelt Island and back. And I don't believe I've ever done that. It was a little bit like a carnival ride. It was fantastic. But I got a bunch of these reference photos and I thought I would use a few of these to try to design a painting. I love the elevated point of view. I love the cacophony of information, all the buildings, the negative space, the laciness of the bridge, the sort of contrast between light and dark, of course, between atmosphere and built environment, between solidity and laciness. This bridge looks very delicate. Obviously it isn't. But it's just so many things that looked exciting to me because this whole idea of contrast is such a big deal for me when I paint. But as I was referencing earlier, views like this, there's just so much stuff. So how do you approach that? How do you decide what is the intent? What's the story of your painting? For me, it was this, primarily the contrast or the dialogue, if you like that term, between negative space, atmosphere, and solidity. I love bridges in general. Of course, they span negative space. They all span time, really. And they're always stories about time. The idea of passing from here to there or from there to here obviously takes up some time, and they're just ripe with analogies and stories, potential stories. I think that's enough said for now. So how do I take all this? For me, I just jump into my sketchbook always. I did this little sketch on the tramway while we were hovering between Roosevelt Island and Manhattan. What I tried to do here was build up a more clear, or better designed, I suppose, hierarchy of values, darks, lights, midtones, deciding to treat most of the background more simply than the reference photos would indicate. So just all midtones, a range of values within the midtones, but lighter to dark midtones. The highest level of contrast I'm going to work in a little bit here on the roadway, I expect in the water. I call those my number one values. They won't all be purely saved white paper, though some may be. And then juxtaposed to that, the darkest darks, which are largely going to be the shadow from under the bridge, along the water, along the street here, and then little bits of the structure coming up and the suspension tower. Yeah, that's my plan. It still looks like a very complicated composition, but I can see it falling into place where the more, they're not really in the foreground, but the closer elements, the bits of bridge, the suspension tower, the supports, vertical supports of the bridge, I think will all be the darkest. The center of interest of any painting is generally where the darkest dark meets the lightest light, and that will be largely here along the base support of the bridge, little bits up here, little bits down here perhaps, so sort of a connected series that, if I do this well, will set up this hopefully poetic, compelling vertical composition of dark light, dark light, dark light, pulling the viewer's eye down through. I think a vertical composition for this kind of view is the way to go, at least in this case. Surely you could envision some beautiful horizontal paintings of the bridge, but they would be very different in nature. So then earlier today I did a bit of a maniacal line drawing. I designed this whole thing on the paper itself just from my little sketch. It is much like this reference photo. It's more like this reference photo than anything, but I suppose what I've done is I've zoomed in a bit closer, edited out some what I considered confusing or unnecessary information, tried to make it more about, really more about the juncture of this great vertical thrust against the horizontal, and then this series of contrasting lights and darks to help illuminate all of that. Everything else in the painting will be hinted at, but played down, simplified, edited out completely. It is a bit more of a drawing than I might normally do for a painting, so I think I want the whole look of this finished piece to be a bit more of a drawing with lighter watercolor laid on, rather than heavy watercolor and no drawing or very little drawing. So I want this to be more of an amalgam of drawing and painting. And I think because of the structural nature of a bridge, I think it'd be appropriate to have a little bit more of the drawing show through and to become more of an upfront part of the final composition. I'm using Baohong paper, 300 gram rough surface. I think the texture of the paper will help create an overall grittiness that should work to my advantage. When you paint on very rough paper, especially doing dry brush marks, you can sort of imply a great deal of detail without really having to draw or paint it. So also I love the surface. It's very light, very white. It doesn't take a lot of glazing. So do I always get my values exactly right? No, I don't, but that's the goal. And on this paper, the closer you can get to getting your values right the first time, the better off you're going to be. All right, these videos have to be a little more than an hour, hour 20 in length, so I think this may be a more time-consuming painting than that, but I'll try to get as much done as I can. As far as a color story, I think because of the complex nature and all of the visual information, I'm going to go with, I don't know if I want to call it a monochrome, but a very limited palette of warm tones, yellows, warms, browns, leading into deeper, probably bluish grays, but a contained color palette, which I think will help settle down and help order, give a little bit of order to the chaotic visual nature. I'm going to do the sky first. It's the farthest away, and I always build my paintings up from the lightest light to the darkest dark. The lightest light, of course, is going to be the white, the untouched white paper, and there will be some of that. So I really start in by painting the lighter midtones first. I'm going to use a yellow sky. That might imply sort of sunset or later in the day, or really nothing really all that specific. Just trying to think of the right words to describe my color theory here. I'm not using color, I suppose, in a descriptive way as I might sometimes. It's more of an organizational tool because of all the visual info. So I'm painting over most everything because unless I want to save it as pure white, it's going to be darker. So the top plane of this bridge is going to pick up a little bit more light, so I am saving that out. This is a light yellow anyway, not very intense. It's a Naples yellow by Holbein. All of this will be darker, so I don't need to hold an edge. I can just paint right over it. This is a permanent orange by Daniel Smith. Just a little bit more warmth I want to add into the top of the sky. I flipped the painting upside down so that I can use gravity to my advantage. I'm painting on about a 40-degree tilt, as I tend to do. And that's just something you can always think of, using gravity to your advantage. Water, naturally, runs downhill. So when you paint with your board or your easel at a tilt, especially when you work rather wet, as I tend to usually, it's just a little assist. Very rough paper, so I'm allowing some of these skip marks. I'm probably going to let them stay. I can get rid of them if I want. They occurred organically, naturally, so I want the top of the sky ultimately to be a little bit lighter than what's going to happen down here, which you will see momentarily. So a few of these skip marks at the very top of the sky to just introduce some pure light in the top, I think, is all to the good. While the painting is quite wet, you can play around the wet and just drop in some additional tonalities. This is some raw umber. I don't want to get into a very technical rendering of all these bridge supports. I'm really hoping the drawing will do a lot of that work for me, so I can just sort of tint in a very impressionistic, loose way over a lot of that, and hopefully I won't need to do a great deal more. I love to draw, and I love to do architectural subjects sometimes and bridges, and all that's fine, but I'm very aware that they can begin to look a little too technical if we don't watch it, or if we become too enamored of straight edges and lines. I certainly don't mind them, but I'm aware that if I'm too dependent on them, my drawing can begin to look a little technical and dry. This is somewhat of a technique. I love the more rational or hard-edged drawing with very loose watercolor on top. If you allow some of that watercolor to enhance the tighter, more strict drawing underneath, doesn't always work, but it can look quite good. So I painted it upside down to help just use gravity to pull the water this way. If I flip it right side up, that's okay, but you have to be a little cautious. If you've used a lot of pigment at the top of the painting, because it can then, if it's too wet, it'll wash back down and create streaks and lines. I, however, was pretty light at the top, so I'm not too worried about it. should be fine. I also want to take advantage of the fact that this is still a bit wet because, as I said, I want the sky and the whole painting really to get a little darker as it recedes into the distance there. I want to treat the city behind as very, the word ambiguous comes to mind, and I don't mean vague on purpose. Well, I guess I do. I just mean I don't want it to dominate or to take over or to look too specific would be a problem. So I'm experimenting with ways to do that. This is some mineral violet and some neutral tint, slightly gray violet tones. I'm just, with a 1/2 inch flat, I'm scraping them into the wet base of that background wash I just did. So you can see I'm not describing objects or elements, not at all. I'm just carving light is the way I describe it. Trying to set the light the way it needs to be, the values, and again, imply detail without really painting any at this stage. Will I go in and add a little bit of clarity to some of these buildings? Sure, I will, but not needed yet. And I want to try to set some of the major values first, and that'll help me determine how much, if anything, I need to do back there. That's fine for now. I don't want to go too crazy. This road, East 60th Street, slants up quite a bit. There's a really appealing shadow that comes off of this, which I haven't quite designed yet, but better to just do it and not think about it too much. So brushes, I did the background largely with a mop brush, one of my brushes made by Neef company that I referenced in the information. It's a whole series of mop brushes. This is a 1/2 inch Escoda flat brush, the Versatile series. So here I'm just trying to meld shadows with substance in a very loose impressionistic way, so nothing looks too rendered or terribly specific. I do want some specificity and some harder edges and clarity, but I'm going to preserve all of that for this area and this, and a little bit up here, and a little bit at the top of the suspension tower. Everything else in the painting, as I said early on, I wanted to look loose and a little bit more fluid. What that does, it just helps tell the viewer what's important, what's most important, what's less important. Where do you, the artiste, want your viewer's eye to be focused? You are in charge of that. Yeah, again, I'm going to try to do as much as I can in the time I've got, but is a pretty complex painting to do as a demonstration, but yeah. I will do the best I can, and hopefully you'll find it useful, or at least moderately entertaining. So as we get more near this area, you can see I'm going to start to gradually tighten up a bit. But what I'm thinking about right now is the foreground of the painting. Do I want to do a very loose wash over this? I think that I do. So what I'm going to try to do is connect this more watery shadow, shade and shadow wash I just did with the big watery wash over the foreground. There's my reinterpretation of the FDR drive here. Doesn't really look like that at all. I've changed it, but I'm trying to decide if I want to save any pure white on that street, or will it help or hurt or make it a better painting. Yeah, I think so, and what that does is informs what kind of brush I want to use. A big mop brush would easily tone that whole area, but if I want to maintain little sparkles of light here and there, probably a flat brush would be a better way to go. I will, of course, tie this all in to what happens up above soon enough. All these different areas of the painting really need, well, for me, everything needs to be connected in my painting. I just don't like anything to be, I don't like that look of paintings where it looks like one area was painted and then another area, and they look all very disjointed. I think one of the magic qualities of watercolor, because of its fluidity, is the way one area can just blend organically into the next. So I'm always, I was going to say stressing out, which I hate that phrase, but I guess it's somewhat true. Thinking about, at least, connections. How do I want to connect this part of the drawing to that part of the painting? So all of that was just to start some of this base wash and preserve a little bit of white left and right. I don't think I need that much white, but as I always say, because it's true, you can always get rid of light. You can paint it out, but once it's painted out, it's pretty hard to regain. All right, I think for the bottom, from here down, I'm going to do one big, larger wash. So for that, I'm going to use, back to my mop brush. This is raw umber. And just let all that run together. And this goes right down into the East River. And then this is a value judgment here. How much detail or specificity do you need, or do you want to get rid of? I want the interest of the painting to be more up here, not so much down here. So I'm going to just allow myself to paint this much more in a sloppier, wetter, looser way than I might normally do. This is some cobalt teal, which will appear elsewhere. I don't want to overdo it, but I think just a hint of that Well, and then a little bit of this neutral tint at the bottom, although there is a little bit of violet mixed in. Yeah, I think that's fine. While it's still wet, you can assess, is this edge too much? Is it too harsh? I don't think so. Here, I think that's fine. Over here, I want to soften or obscure that edge a little. So I'll use my Holbein mist bottle to just add a little bit of water and allow some of those tones to run together. And because of the slant tilt of my board, it encourages all those tones and colors just to merge more organically. What that does is it takes the focus away from the edges, brings it more into the center, and I like that. Yeah, there is water here, but I don't want to make such a big deal out of it. A different kind of painting I might, but for this one, no, I don't want to. While that's still quite wet, if you think it's needed, you can play around. There are these openings that are sort of there, but I've sort of designed them in this Embarcadero wall. I don't want them to be overly rendered or hard edged, so just wet and wet, I'm implying them with a slightly smaller mop brush. Again, we'll just sort of imply some detail without really showing too much. I think for now that's good. I will come back to that area, I'm sure. But I've gone a long way into getting it pretty nearly finished. So at this stage of the painting, I've done, a reasonable amount of the lighter to mids, getting into the darker parts of the mid-tones. Everything so far is mid-toned, except for the saved bits. They're the lightest light, but I have done none of my darkest darks yet. A little concerned here. That teal is such a beautiful color, but it tends to streak, and certainly not a big deal, but I don't like what I'm seeing, so I think I'm going to try to feather it in with just some implied ripples in the water. Yes. Okay, now while I was doing all that, this is not dry yet, but it's getting there. And at this stage of value design or light carving or whatever fancy term you want to use, I think you can begin then to establish how much more information you can get away with, or you need or you don't need in the background. And that's the thing to try to finish or nearly finish at this stage. So again, it isn't 100% dry, but it's dry enough to where it'll hold an edge if I need it to, and ideally it would still be wet down here so that it can bleed away and be more obscure. But if it's not, I can use my mist bottle to introduce light. Okay, I think doing those smaller mid-sized flats are going to be the way to go. Will certainly be the quickest way to imply any kind of, not going to use the word detail because it's not really detail, but identity that you might want on those background buildings. Going to keep it all in the color family for now. This is a raw umber, so just a nice neutral warm tone, a 1/2 inch flat. And really employing, hopefully successfully, dry brush marks that allow the substance to sort of melt away and become non-substance. Or what I want to do is build up a little sense of a skyline without having it pull forward or be too dominant. So I think the dry brush marks are the way to go. For now, this is all raw umber, or you could use raw sienna. It's a bit too yellow, I think, or yellow ochre, but raw umber, I think, for this painting is probably the best way to go. I'm going to move this painting around just to make it easier for me to reach. I apologize, but I'm always a little surprised when I'm teaching and I see painters just struggling to reach one side of the painting or another, or stressing out over blossoms and streaks. So often, if you just add a little bit of tilt, or turn your board this way or that, tilt it up or down, you have so much control over how quickly the water runs from one side of the painting to another, from top to bottom. That's all in your control. So don't give it up. Just remind yourself that you're in charge of that. So you can just make your painting experience so much easier just by choosing to tilt the board, to lay it more flat, more angled, turn it sideways, whatever makes your task easier, do it. So I like the general mojo of this. I think it looks like a distant city. I don't think anything's too aggressive or dark yet, so that it's pulling forward. I don't, however, want it to just look messy, so we'll just keep going and I'll assess it as I go along. There's things in watercolor you can plan, but it's also important to realize that you just cannot plan everything. Some things are just going to happen that you didn't plan, and that's really good. It's the way it should be. As some of these buildings get a little more near to us, I'm adding a little bit of violet here and there, just for some subtle value shifts to get them to pull forward just a little. And so really you can see I'm working in complementary tones of yellows. The raw umber, I'm thinking of it isn't actually yellow, but it's in the yellowish family. The Naples yellow underneath, a little bit of that orange tone still reach through, and then the violet just sings off of it in a relatively sophisticated way, I hope. This all looks fairly indistinct, mottled, Not necessarily very appealing yet, but just you wait. When all of these other elements are added, especially the deeper value, you'll see it, I think, things will snap into focus a little bit more than they might look as if they are right now. Wow, less is really more. I just don't want to do much back there. There's so much information that has to be more clearly delineated up front. So the less I do back there, the better. As the painting progresses, if I really think I need more information back there, it's pretty easy to revisit those areas and add it, but very difficult to take things away once they're there. Not impossible always, but if you can avoid it, you absolutely should. The east side of Manhattan these days has these crazy tall, skinny and tall residential towers that are quite amazing. Whether you like them or not, they're a topic of much discussion. Yeah, there's a whole series of these enormously tall but very, very thin. Their footprint is very skinny, and can't really imagine what it would be like to live in an apartment on the 80-something floor. It's exciting, but I don't know. So this part of the bridge is all open and lacy. So it wouldn't be solid. It's not solid material. You'd see through it. I want to maintain a lot of light, but so whatever I add in this area, I have to do judiciously so that I don't kill all the light. So I'm just using a little bit of raw umber, a little bit more of the Naples yellow to imply some of these buildings that you'd see lightly through. I think for now that's enough. The light is coming from the south, so from the left side to the right side. Wasn't quite as aggressive in reality. I've amped it up a bit. Although in the reference photos it's pretty stark contrast. This side of the bridge, it's all open, but I'm going to make it a bit darker just to coalesce the shapes. But I also do not want it to look solid as a solid mass. So a little bit of a dance there. Hopefully I'm clever enough to make that work. Time will tell. So this is raw umber, a little bit more, it's wet, but a little bit more pigment than I've been using to just begin to add some of the tonality to the shade side of the bridge. I'm going to allow my brush marks to get sketchier and more dry brush as they come down to hopefully enhance that sense of light shining through. So again, it's a bit of a difficult little dance because I want the whole side of this bridge to look like a somewhat darker shape, darker mid-tone, but not solid. I don't want it to look closed off from the light. So my thinking is if I get the top edge of this shape to hang together, I can allow the bottom edge of this shape to be pretty sketchy and dry brushed. A lot of light and air coming through. And it should work. The coloration will help, so I want to keep it more toward the lighter, warmer tones that sort of imply light. The raw umbers, ochres, and a little bit less of the violet, which tends to make it look a little more solid, I think. So yeah, generally that's okay. I don't think I wanted any more dark than that. As this comes down to meet this, however, I think I do want that to hang together a little bit more strong against the background. So I'm going to drop in a little bit more violet. Boy, it's such a complicated structure. There's I think at least there's 2 lanes of car traffic. There's a pedestrian walkway here. There's a lot going on. Now I'm going to start introducing some of this deeper warm brown. It's a Van Dyke brown. That I'm going to reserve mostly for this area, I believe. I'm using just the side edge of a flat brush to just begin implying some of the structure just to see how that looks. So this dry brush application, I love it, I use it a lot, but I'm also aware it can look really messy if you don't juxtapose it here and there with the more traditional ways of painting, more solid areas. So it's just the mixture that's important. I'm usually a very big fan of painting reflected light bounced up into shadows. I think in this case, the underside of the bridge, I'm going to keep it graphic and relatively dark, just as a shape. I just think it'll help make everything a little bit more understandable. But largely, I think rather than the violets or grays, I'm going to keep it in the deeper warm tonalities. We'll see. But it just needs to be dark, so I don't think I need to get too fancy as far as coloration. It's okay, but not dark enough. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of French Ultra Blue, drop it into this Van Dyke Brown. That sort of warm, cool complement will make a deeper, more saturated neutral. And as the bridge underside gets nearer to us, I'm going to use a little bit more of this blue, just dropping it in. Wasn't a color I intended to use, but now that I'm starting to, I can see that it's going to be useful. So again, connections. I don't want the underside of the bridge to look disconnected to the vertical face, so I will, before that dries, paint in much of the stonework down below, at least the shadow portions. This is some raw sienna. I'm sorry, burnt sienna. So a medium to slightly darker warm tone, very earthy, but I'm just bringing it up and letting it bounce into this dark bluer brownish gray neutral wash and letting it all run down together to connect. I don't mind that warm tone, but I don't know that I want to overdo it, so a little of it I think will go a long way. I'll go back into more some raw umbers. There are so many beautiful, unusual bridges in this city, iconic bridges too. Of course, right down the rivers, the incomparable Brooklyn Bridge from the late 1800s. I mean, it's just poetic. It's so gorgeous. But it kind of gets all the attention, and other bridges like this one tend not to. No, I don't intend to leave this pier entirely white, but I'm just painting in the shadows for now. It's a little bit backward way of doing it, but I think it'll all make sense. So just using indiscriminate tonalities of warms and cools, bits of blues, warms and reds. So I pre-painted this shadow, which is fine, but it's not quite dark enough entirely. But that's all right. Most of the work is done. I can just feather in these connecting elements with some dry brush, I believe. And all will be well. There's this very graphic shadow that comes down here across the road, down against the wall and over on the water. So I'm going to flesh that out now. So it's very graphic, but I don't want it to be quite as dark coming right off the page. Mostly the value jump, I want to keep it up here. This giant shadow of the bridge. This will just soften the edge. You know, how you terminate your paintings are very critical. For me, they are. Like trying to keep the focus where you want it and not where you don't want it. So harder edges, more contrast, of course, gonna pull the viewer's eye. Softer edges, less contrast. The viewer's eye will just jump over it, which is what you want. So it's that kind of thing I was fussing with just there. Not too bad. I've neglected this for now. I want to try to establish that, and maybe the main values on this distant wall aren't quite there yet. A little bit more work on the towers, and then I may stop the video because it's going to go on for quite a while. There's information behind the piers here. It's a little vague. There are some trees and unkept greenery. I'm not avoiding it exactly. I am a little because I'm not 100% sure how I think it's best to deal with it. I don't know how much I want to introduce green into this whole painting, so I'm trying to think. I may keep the foliage just in these some more subtle tones of teal, somewhat similar to what I did there. I do know that I want to keep it very, very indistinct and not very important because it's not, but the value of it is somewhat important, and so I'm not trying to be realistic because it's actually there on the site. But in order to make the brightness of those bridge piers pop out, I definitely need the value on either side and between. So a little bit of teal and some violet should do the trick, with little bits of raw umber bounced in. Yeah, that'll do. Here I just used raw umber to keep the value jump from the shadowy underside of the bridge as crisp as I can. Okay, this beautiful pier, I want to be a little bit fussy there because it's beautiful. It's a little bit important as the center of interest, almost the star of the show. The contrast here, that dialogue is most important. This will become quite dark, as this did, but the top of that tower quite light. I don't want to look at the reference because I don't want to get too swayed by what might actually be there. Again, the downside of reference photos, they tend to make you think that what looks important in terms of site observation may not be as important for your painting. It's what looks good in the painting that matters. So that could mean you change things, add things, leave things out, edit things away, redesign them, move them, change their color. It's such a big deal when you realize you have both the power and I would say even the responsibility to do that on occasion, and you can just discard a lot of the other indicators of reality. It's a little tricky when you're painting something that's very well known or iconic, if you're doing a painting of the Eiffel Tower or San Marco in Venice, yeah, it's a little presumptuous for the painter to change the color or shape of it, but don't be afraid to do it. There's a jillion painters that have already painted it, so whatever they think you did wrong, I'm sure they'll do right. But there's just no wrong way to do anything in painting, really. For me, that was such a wake-up call. I think I spent so many years of my life, well, when I was young, I spent many years of my life not worrying about it at all, just having fun and drawing and painting whatever I wanted because I wanted to. But when I started to study art and tried to teach myself to become a professional, I got very hung up in what was right and what was wrong and what the so-called rules are. Yeah, I think it's all right to listen and to know what other people think the right things to paint or the right ways to paint are, but ultimately, when I realized that didn't matter so much, I could discard this rule or that rule if it made my painting look better. That was a big deal for me. And also when I reclaimed my childish joy of drawing and painting, that sort of went hand in hand with that attitude of just realizing rules are often there for a reason, of course, but they're very often rules of thumb. They're not, there are no, or there shouldn't be. There are self-described art police, but they might know what works for them, but they certainly don't always know what works for you, if ever. And honestly, I think it's, I don't want to use the word brave, that seems a little pretentious, but it's a personal courage, I suppose, or taking responsibility for yourself to, when you get to the point where you say, oh, there really aren't rules, there's just what works for me. And being willing and able to stand up and say, that doesn't work for me, this does. I like to paint this way, not that way. Everything starts to click into place once you do that. It did for me anyway. Did everybody magically agree with me? Gosh, no. Quite the opposite. But I didn't care as much. I felt like I understood my purpose and my path better than I had before, and that's what mattered. So do I always do great paintings? No. I mean, do I ever do a great painting? I don't know. But I know I have the possibility of doing them the more I listen to myself and take my own advice more than the advice of others. Sorry, I got philosophical. That's what happens when I paint. I'm just trying to distract myself from my nervousness of screwing this up. I hope it's clear that what I'm doing so far in this painting and overall is I'm not really trying to describe the realistic identity of anything. What I'm trying to do is design a painting. An interesting, well-balanced composition of shapes and values. The actual physical identity of something, I'm leaving it alone. With the exception of here, I got into a bit of identity. And as this dries, I will assess. I'm certainly going to add some dry brush marks, some stone texture, and that sort of thing here and there. But those are almost embellishments. They're not the purpose or the point of this painting. I design all of my paintings really in an abstract way, like an abstract composition of shapes of value, that even if you didn't know what you were looking at, should all somehow still work. All right. Yeah, I think a little bit more tone on this side of the bridge is needed. I wanted it to remain airy, and I think it has, but it's dried a little lighter than I hoped it would look. In a moment, I'm going to go in and add some identities similar to this to the top of the bridge, but then I want to feather it down into the bottom of the bridge in a lacier, less distinct way. Heavily relying on dry brush marks to, again, imply some of that transmission of light and laciness and airiness. Without getting too engrossed in technical rendering. So here what I'm trying to do is just get the clarity of this bridge to dissolve really into the lack of clarity of the distance, to keep purposefully a little vague and mysterious looking, not just trying to be messy, but trying to use a contrast of clarity and obscurity in a compelling way. This kind of painting, it would just so easy to get lost in a sea of details, and there are kinds of paintings where that makes sense, but generally, at least for me, that it doesn't serve me well. Way back here, there's a little ticket terminal, the end point where the cable cars come to rest, a little station. Again, I'm not rendering it, I'm just implying it. It's there somewhere. So all those little marks are really not to add identity, they're just to add sort of a value anchor to all of this terminating here. This tower that suspends the cable cars is going to be a little bit darker, a little bit more specific than anything behind it, but yeah. All right, so at this stage what I want to do is a little bit of work on the vertical tower supports. That I think will flesh out the top, and then I'll have a very good sense of how my value design overall throughout the painting is working. I think I'm on track as far as my little value sketch went. I'll check in a moment. So here I'm going to use this Van Dyke Brown, an 1/8 inch flat brush for now. Add just a bit more clarity and punch to some of these elements at the very top. Again, I don't want them to be consistent all the way down. I want it to still fade out a little bit. I have this very tiny Escoda 1/8 inch Perla flat that I know I'm going to be relying on for this kind of thing. Just very small areas of dry brush. That I think will add all the sort of technical clarity that I need without again looking too technical. Yeah, you could go absolutely crazy and detail this thing for a week, but I don't know that I know it wouldn't make it a better painting. It would make it a very different kind of painting, and what I'm going to try to do is just imply or hint at some of this lacy structure without getting too lost in all the specifics. This is a Perla brush. It's all synthetic, so it makes very beautiful, sophisticated marks, or it's capable of doing that. But it isn't, because it's synthetic, it runs out of water a little more quickly than a natural hairbrush might, and so it aids me in getting these beautiful, scrapey, aerated dry brush marks. Probably do a little more than that, but hopefully not too much more. Painting upside down is also, I was going to say it's a gimmick. I don't know if that's the right word. That seems deceiving. It's can be a tool to help you see the values of your painting a little more clearly and see it more as an abstract composition and get you a little bit more out of the mindset of rendering specific details. You could really start to see what it needs graphically and in terms of value without getting lost in all the little absolutes, the identities. So again, up here, this top plane of the bridge, I want it to look more bright and illuminated than the rest. So I'm being very minimal about anything I paint up here. This is all more in ochres and lighter tones, warms. I think I'm going to rely a little bit more on the pencil drawing underneath to tell the story. the very top, I'm going to go into some slightly darker tones, more of the Van Dyke brown, little bits of probably neutral tint and little bits of even blue, the French Ultra. Don't need a lot of identity up here, but it does need some value to help anchor the whole painting. I'm going to go to one of my smaller Neef brush mops. Just make beautiful points so you can get some hints of detail without being too picky about it, but just the idea of it. Pretty good. So what I'm doing is just trying to get a bounce of contrast at the top of the painting to build up this tripartite design of light, 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 to pull the viewer's eye down through, as I showed in the in my values sketch, which I've lost, but it's here somewhere. Yes, we're upside down, but yeah, in a way it makes it easier to see it. I'm building up this dark light, dark light, dark light, dark light pattern all the way through and then terminating at the top of the painting. And I'm pretty happy because it is, generally speaking, it's working. Bridge is the real focus, the real star. So I know I want a little bit more dark over here to help balance, but it's good I did this first because going too dark on that element, I believe, would be an error. So I want to keep it darker, but not too dark. So these, of course, are getting into my darkest darks. There's nothing nearly black here, but darker than the midtones, obviously lighter than the light tones, but it's starting to develop a real sense of foreground, midground, background, which is what I want. And again, I want to detail some of the values on this supporting tower, but don't want it to get overly dark to pull too much forward. It belongs pretty distinctly in the midground, and that's where it should be. So I think rather than going darkest darks on it, I'm going to go probably darker midtones for the darkest elements. So I'm using cobalt blue and raw umber with little bits of Van Dyke brown. This tram terminal is just a couple of blocks from my house, and I'm a bit embarrassed. I don't think in all the years I've been here I've ever rode it until the other day. It's not something I think I'd forget. But it's pretty magical. It's like going to a carnival. But it's part of the New York City transit system. People take it all the time. Yes, this dodgy exercise here and trying not to be overly explicit. That's fine. One way to do that, if you're rendering, say, loads of building windows on a wall, is just to leave some of them out or to do some of them slightly different than some of the others. It makes the end result look a lot more fluid and painterly than if you paint all of them just the same. So I'm using that attitude. I'm trying to here on the structural identity where I don't paint every single thing, but just allow some of it to be left out, some of it to be a little bit more implied than stated. And the viewer's eye hopefully can fill in the rest. It's a little dodgy. I mean, you want it to look fluid and loose, but you don't want it to look overly messy, so it's just walking a bit of a fine line. This little 1/8 inch brush will be great for some of these dry brush marks to add some character into the stonework. I'm going to indicate one of these harrowing little cable cars up here. Again, I'm going to try to be loose and sketchy about it and not too overly rendering-ish. Now there's these cables, which it's a choice. You could choose to ignore them, not paint them. I think it's part of all the energy of this entire composition, and so I think it needs them. So I am going to do it. For that, I'm going to use this is a Neef brush, a very small round, number 2, but it's very tiny. I often use it for wiring and small tree limbs and that sort of thing. The key is to use paint that's not entirely opaque, but a little more opaque than not. Very little water, a very light pressure on your brush, and just sort of lift your hand off. Use a little bit of variated pressure so you get sort of the start-stop feeling. And I think when you do that, it gives an overall more believable look to this kind of line work, rather than just an overall solid line. So what I did there was I pressed down, I lifted off and pressed down again at the very end. I don't know, it's hit or miss. It can also, as the fluid runs out, you can start to get some really beautiful dry brush effects. This kind of thing, tree limbs, wires, etc. They're fun to try. Not thinking about them too much helps. Just sort of take a deep breath. Hope for the best. They're more going the other direction that just fade away into the distance, down to the little terminal in the distance. Again, like everything, I don't think there's any need to be terribly specific or realistic about these things. It's just the idea that you're painting. Most all of the big moves in this painting are there now. Is it finished? No, but the main lights, darks pattern is set the way I hoped it would be. So I think overall there's a pretty good balance, a pattern, a sort of an energetic pattern throughout the painting of darks and lights. There's a pretty good establishment of the identity of the bridge without, I hope, it's looking too fussy or too technical. There's an overall feeling of the energy of the place, movement, the bridge, the cable car, the water. There's cars on the road, which I've ignored up to now. There's going to be just a detail at the very end to see how much I think they're needed or not. So at this stage, all the big moves are in, the lights, the midtones, the darks, the shapes, the overall balance of composition. Am I done? No, I would say this painting is probably 85% complete. I do want to do a bit more work on the water, but not enough to detract from anything up here. Probably a bit more work here, but I want to think about it a bit and not overdo it. I saved a lot of white. I think that's good, but I think I probably saved a little too much. I don't need as much over here, so I'm going to dry brush a bit of that away in a little while. And yes, things like cars and street busyness I will address, but I want to play it down as much as I can. Again, a little bit more water identity, but I'm going to keep it minimal. I think as far as the video, though, I'm going to stop it now, and I'll finish it off camera. But I hope you found this helpful, at least in terms of when you might approach an urban scene or any view, scene of person, place, or thing that seems daunting or overly complex. I hope this gave you some things to think about to help you along the way. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you real soon.